Hey guys, welcome back. If you remember where we left off, we had created a very simple pipeline. That pipeline took one table from SQL Server and we imported it directly into our data lake, and we just dropped it right into the landing zone, and we didn't really organize it. We hard coded just about everything, so everything was static. So you can see over here that I've actually dumped those resources into static folders. Um, and it worked, but we need to start thinking about how we might scale this. So what we can do actually is kind of think about a different type of pipeline. So I'll just put this in a dynamic folder and I'll create a new pipeline. Now this first pipeline, I'm actually not going to do it. We're just going to talk about it, and then we're going to actually step into building it in a second. But if we think about having a copy transformation or copy activity, instead of just doing the one, what we might want to do is actually do this for a big list. So for that list, what we might do is look up several items, and then what we could do is iterate through that list of items. And then instead of having this off to the side, what we could do is create a copy activity within. And so what this would mean is if we have this kind of dynamic lookup, then what we would do is have a dynamic source and a dynamic sink. So it's really three dynamic components. The dynamic source, this could be an Excel file, or it could be a SQL query. We've got a lot of flexibility here. And what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to tap into the information schema within SQL Server, because what I want to get is I want to go through a list of tables. And so when we did the one table, what we did was we basically said, well, hey, I want to pick a table, and I'm just going to pick a schema and a table name, and that was it. But instead what we could do is actually create a big long list of schemas and table names. And that's what we're going to do, is iterate through a list that way. So let's go on ahead and delete this first pipeline, because we need some of the prerequisites first. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create some dynamic sets. So I'm going to have a new folder called dynamic. And then within this, we're going to create 3 data sets. So the very first data set will be kind of a placeholder for what I just showed you here. So I want to have a placeholder for my query, so that I have a list that I can iterate through. And so this will be SQL Server again. We will utilize my existing link service, and I'll call this dynamic table list. So I don't need to iterate, or I don't need to enter anything for the table name. Will just be kind of a placeholder right now that has a working connection to the database, but we don't exactly know what data is going in here just yet. All right, next up will be a placeholder for each one of those tables then. So if we have a placeholder for the list, next what we need to do is iterate through that list and basically create a placeholder for each of the tables in that list. So SQL Server, continue. We'll do the same link service again. This time it will be dynamic SQL table. So this table is going to be updated each time. We will enter this manually. I'll say OK. So at the moment, we don't really know the table name. What we can do, though, is supply some parameters for that name. So if we think about how we would do this, it would be the table schema and the table name. So let's do that. We'll call it table schema, and we'll do table name. Okay. So go back to this connection. We'll do this manually, and then we'll just parameterize this. So let me get the table schema. Okay. And then I'll do this one as well, and I'll get the table name. Okay. All right, and similarly for the last of the 3 dynamic data sets, we need somewhere for this data to go. So this time we'll do a lake object. This will be Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So I'll say OK, continue. These will be Parquet files, continue. I will use the same link service that I used before for my Parquet files. For this one, we'll call this dynamic ADLS parquet. For the landing path, I'm going to go ahead and say this is going into my landing folder. So, and just so you can see this, I cleared out my landing zone before, so we'll have something fresh where we can start dumping everything. And we'll go on ahead and say, okay. However, we do want this to be dynamic and this as well. So let's go on ahead and create a couple more parameters. And so we'll call this first one folder name, and then we'll do another one for the file name. So we'll go back to this connection and make this the folder name, and then make this one the file name. Okay, so at this point we've got 3 dynamic data sets that we can start working with. Right now they hold no data. They've got some linked services, meaning that we've got permission to work with some objects, but we don't really have any objects to work with just yet. So let's go on ahead and create our new folder. This is going to be dynamic. It deleted before because I deleted all the objects in it, which it's kind of annoying, but whatever. So let's create a new pipeline in this one. I'll give it a super creative name, calling it dynamic pipeline. Let's see. One of the first things that I want to do with this is I'm already thinking about front loading this with some parameters. So I'm going to front load this with a database. And I'm also going to front load this with a schema. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But next up, what I want to do is actually start bringing in some of the major components of this. So like I said, the very first thing that I showed you was general, and this is just a lookup. So for this lookup, I don't like this name, so I'm just going to call it lookup SQL tables. The lookup activity itself has some settings. So for this one, remember, we just created a data source for this, which was the dynamic table list. So we'll do that. We will not do first row only. I want the entire list. And we're not pulling in a table at the moment. We're actually creating this with a query. So for this, I've got a query off to the side that I wanted to show you. So let's take a look. Sorry, I actually got interrupted by a phone call. So I think what I was doing was I was going to show you the kind of the query that we're going to write. So you can do this however you want. You could have a table that you've already stored in SQL Server. It could be an Excel file. It can be a query, a stored product. You've got a lot of flexibility here. What we're going to do though is just kind of take advantage of the information schema. The information schema brings back a table schema and a name. Now, of course, there's different schemas that different information schema components you can pull from. This is the one that I'm going to do. And so you can see here that, if we did one table, we could just pull back, sales dot, sales tax rate. The information it's pulling back is table schema and then table name. For myself, we can kind of limit this. So right now we are seeing with that leading V, we're seeing views. So we can isolate this to base table. We can also isolate this to a particular schema. And that's kind of the approach that we're going to take, is we're going to limit this to base tables and we're going to limit this to a particular schema. However, what I want to do is I want to limit this to schema, but I want that schema to be dynamically generated. So I want that to come from a parameter so that if I want to pull from one schema one day and a different schema a different day, we've got that flexibility. The other thing that I wanted to do is there are a couple of tables that I know will cause some issues with this pipeline. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-filter those out. And what I'll do in a future video is show you kind of some cool error messaging that we can do with some webhooks. So let's go on ahead and just grab this query though. And I'm going to put this in here. And I think that is all I need for this one. So I've basically got my dynamic data set. I've said, no, I do not want to just do the first row only. We're going to grab our list by using a query. And here's the query itself. It's expecting a parameter, which we have not supplied yet. So if I save this, and then I try to debug it, I need to pass in a parameter. For the database, And then I need to pass in a parameter for the schema. So we'll do, the person schema for this one. We'll say okay. And then let's see what we get. Let's refresh this so we can see that it is queued up right now. And we'll get some input here in a second. Let's just let this go. So it succeeded. Let's see what the output is. So the output is this value, and then it's just kind of like this list that we're going to iterate through. And so when we iterate through this, we're going to iterate through the output of this, and then we're going to pull out the value. And then the value that we're looking for is this table schema and then table name. And so what that's going to do is populate, hey, person, and then person.person phone, person.state province, person.business entity. So that's what we're going to be populating when we do our for each loop. So now that we know that part works, let's take a look at the for each section. So iteration and conditions, we'll do a for each. Now, assuming that this works, we're going to move on to the for each piece. So the for each, I'm going to say for each table in SQL query, we will do, we will have to iterate through these items. And so the items that we're going to iterate through, let's just do this dynamically. We've got a couple of activity outputs. So let's take a look. So we've got the activity output is looking it up by name, and I just showed you that we're going to be pulling out the value. So let's do that. I'll say okay. So that's the very first part. So next up, we actually need an activity, and the activities we're going to have would be, let's use the pencil, and we're going to add an activity. Well, this is what we were working with before. This is that basic kind of copy transformation step. So we'll just say copy SQL table to ADLS Parquet. Okay, so now we've kind of got a descriptive name here. So now we want to take a look at the source. The source will be our dynamic table source, or our dynamic SQL table, and our sink will be our dynamic ADLS Parquet. Now, for the source, we have some parameters that need to be populated because we don't know what the table schema is just yet. So let's grab it. I want to get this, I believe, from the item, and then the item will be, I think it's table schema. We'll say okay. And then the same deal here. The item dot table name. We'll say okay. Now, if you recall, in the last one, what we did for the lookup, we had a query, but for this one, we actually are doing a table. It just so happens that we are populating the table each time based on the results of that lookup. So I think we're good here on the SQL table, but we need to finish up the sync part of it because that is also dynamic as well. All right, so this will be a little bit more complicated. So think about our Parquet, which is our landing zone, or I said our Parquet. Think about our Parquet files and where they will land. I'm dropping them in the landing zone, but I want this landing zone to make sense. So at the highest level within SQL Server, or the second highest level, we've got kind of this three-part identifier, which is database, and then schema, and then within a schema, we've got, well, I'm not doing that right. We've got a schema, and then we've got a table name. So it's a three-part identifier. I'm going to do something really similar in the lake. I want it to go landing zone, then I want to know what database did it come from, what schema did it come from. I want to know the table name. But then I'm also going to do this potentially on, a scheduled, reoccurring basis. So I also want to know when that file was imported. So I want to know the year, the month, the day, and then I'll just drop the file down kind of in that folder path. So that way it makes my ETL from the landing zone that much easier because I can go back and grab a snapshot from a given day. And if you remember, we had that kind of lifecycle management around this. So if your volume of snapshots gets to be too much, we can mess around with faster deletes if we want to. But let's hop back into this code. So we've got the folder name and the file name. Let's actually skip ahead to the file name. I think that one will be the easiest. I'm just going to paste this in here. So what we have is just a couple pieces here. So we have a concat function, and that concat function is going to concatenate the item.table name, and then it's going to also just tag that at the end with .parquet so we know what the file type is. So let's just get rid of all those extra lines and just paste that in. We'll say okay. But next up, this is going to be a little bit more complicated, and we're going to do this dynamically as well. I'm going to go ahead and just drop this code in for you, and then we're going to talk about it. So let's see, this is my webhooks note. Let's do a new notepad. All right, so this is kind of hard to read, but let's just go on ahead and just break this up. So the first thing I'm doing is kind of splitting out that concat piece. And so let's go on ahead and break this out by each item that we are concatenating. I think that that's probably good enough. Okay, so the first thing that I'm putting in here is the database. Now, if you remember, for the pipeline itself, the pipeline is populated with a parameter called database. So that's going to take care of that first level of the folder for us. Then a slash, because it's going to be a new subfolder within that. That subfolder will be the schema name. So I'm grabbing that as the item. So if you remember, each iteration, we're pulling out the value of an item, which would be, the first one is going to be the table schema, slash, because it's going to be a new subfolder, then the table name. Finally, there's one more slash. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is create a folder structure based on the date. So the date, if we think about it like this, we want to have year, month, day. For myself, I live in the Eastern time zone, so what I'm going to do is format my date. So I'm going to convert my time zone from the UTC now to Eastern time, and then I'm going to format it so that it looks like year, month, day. And so I'm basically taking that database, the slash, the schema, the slash, table name, slash, and then the date part. So kind of getting all that stuff together so it's this kind of like nice hierarchical namespace, which that's what ADLS is for. So I've got this nice kind of clean folder structure. I don't need to save that, but I will say okay. So at this point, I have a kind of dynamic pipeline. I'll save this. And what I should be able to do, unless I made a mistake somewhere, is debug this. I'll populate it with my database. So that was AdventureWorks 2022. And we'll try this with human resources. We'll say okay. Now let's take one more quick look to show that we do not have anything in this landing zone right now. Let's do a refresh. So we can see that a lot of stuff is queued up right now. So the lookup table has already executed. The output from that we see, I did this for human resources. So it's going through and it's querying for the human resources and it's bringing in some tables that are in that schema. So close out of this. So we've already got a couple that were successful and we've got some that are queued up. Let's refresh this again. It should be just about done. And now they're all successful. So if I come in here, go to my ellipses, refresh, now I've got AdventureWorks 2022, human resources is the schema. I've got each one of those tables that were in my list here. Now I can go in and say, okay, well, when was this table imported? Okay, here it is. So that kind of gives me something that I can work with as a nice, simple landing zone. But next up, we might want to schedule this. So what we'll do is add a trigger for this. Sorry, I actually had a little technical difficulty there. What we're doing was adding a trigger for this. So we'll just create a new one here. We'll do a new trigger, and we'll just call this one trigger import. And what we did already was we imported human resources. So for this trigger, let's do a trigger person. We'll do this on a schedule. Today is the 24th. So we'll go on ahead and start this one today. And let's do this one at, what is it? It's 4 o'clock, which I believe is 1600. I'm okay with it, starting here. Now, I don't know why why did it change the date on me? Okay. Okay, so we got this at 5:24 and then 1600 or 4 p.m. 4:25, that's fine. We'll do this every day. We'll do this every 1 day. Um, for the execution time of this, it will be 1600, and then we'll set this for the 30-minute mark. Um, Specify an end date. The 25th will be fine for me. So basically, I want to get this code in within the next couple minutes and published, so that we can go on ahead and kick this off. But like I said, we're going to populate this trigger with a parameter. So let's populate the value. This will be VentureWorks 2022. Hopefully I typed that right. And this will be the person schema. So I'll say OK. Now that we have a pipeline, let's come over here and take a look. We're still in our working branch right now. The trigger person should be associated with that dynamic pipeline. And if we look at the curly braces, the JSON, we see now that we've got the parameters populated for that database. So what we'll do is come up here to GitHub. We'll check our code in. So we've got the trigger created. Give it just a second and we will actually, let's hop over here first to my data factory one more time, and we'll go to my main branch. So we're going to update this trigger that we have here. I'd created one before while I was testing. All right, so get the main trigger created. Now, if we refresh this, we should see that it's with that dynamic pipeline. We're in the main branch. We see that it's that person within VentureWorks. The start time, the end time, we see the hour is 16 and the minute's 30, so that's what we wanted. Let's go on ahead and publish this so it will actually kick off. We'll say OK. I'm going to go ahead and pause this while it's publishing because that'll take just a minute. Not super long though. Okay, so it's published and it generated the ARM templates, so that should be all good. And so next what we're going to do is monitor. So we're going to have some pipeline runs here in a minute and some trigger runs. Well, some will be basically one of each. And what we're going to take a look at is, let's go to our landing zone. So we already have this VentureWorks folder created for the database. And then we got the human resources folder created for that schema. But what we're bringing in would be the person tables. So this will be kind of the list of tables that we're looking for, minus one of these tables that I've filtered out. So it's 4:29. Let's pause and I'll be back in just 1 minute. All right, I'm back. So it's 4:30. Let's take a look at our trigger runs, see if they're actually doing anything. Let's come over here to, sorry, pipelines. Okay, so the dynamic pipeline is running. Let's take a look at our triggers. So it just took a second for it to refresh. But the trigger for the import person looks like it succeeded. And let's go over here to the pipeline itself, which is in progress. We can take a look at the parameters that were sent with that, and we have the database and the person schema. We can probably take a look at this pipeline itself and see kind of what's going on with it. So we've got a couple tables that look like have already succeeded, and now it's running through some of these other ones. Let's hop in here and do a quick refresh to see what's going on. We now have a new folder, and we've got multiple tables that are being populated. Let's give this just another minute to finish. It should be done pretty soon. Let's head over here to my pipeline runs. This is still in progress. Do a refresh on that. It's been running for about a minute. We'll pause it and come right back. And the status is now successful. So let's come back over here. We'll do a refresh. All right, so we got a handful more tables. And if we were to pop into one of those tables, what we would see is kind of that date structure I was telling you about. So it's the database, the schema, the table name, the path, basically the date path, and then the file itself. So that was about everything that I wanted to cover in this one. In the next video, what we're going to do is take a look at what we can do with failures. Specifically, if something in this fails, we can send a notification through the use of a webhook to something like Teams, or in the example I'll show you, it will be setting this up to go to a channel within Slack. So stay tuned, and look forward to showing you how to do this.